October 14, 1978, Portland, Oregon. When Detective Marcus Holloway descended the concrete steps into the basement of 4427 Willamette Street, he expected to find evidence of a missing persons case. What he discovered instead would haunt him for the remaining 32 years of his life. In the center of the basement stood a contraption that defied immediate understanding. A massive wooden wheel, 7 feet in diameter, fitted with leather restraints and a complex pulley system. The walls were lined with what appeared to be pet supplies, water bottles, feeding trays, cedar shavings scattered across the floor, but the restraints were human-sized. The feeding schedule posted on the wall tracked a person, not an animal. "I've seen a lot in 20 years on the force," Holloway later testified, "but nothing prepared me for what we found in that basement. Nothing." But the truth was far more terrifying than even he first realized. Before we uncovered the truth about the hamster wheel of death, pet owner's torture device revealed, where a basement prisoner was kept like a rodent. Make sure to subscribe to Fear's Sermon and ring that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. The Pacific Northwest in the late 1970s existed in a peculiar psychological space. The counterculture optimism of the previous decade had curdled into something darker. The revelation of government conspiracies through Watergate, the unsolved Zodiac killings, and the recent horrors of Jonestown had shattered America's faith in authority and human goodness. People were learning that monsters didn't always announce themselves with obvious evil. Sometimes they were your neighbors, your coworkers, the friendly face at the grocery store. Portland in 1978 was experiencing rapid growth. Young professionals were flooding into the city, drawn by cheap rent and the promise of reinvention. The neighborhoods of Southeast Portland were transitioning from working-class enclaves to areas where newcomers could buy old houses and transform them. The Willamette Street area was exactly this kind of transitional zone, a tree-lined street of aging craftsman homes, where newcomers mixed uneasily with long-time residents who'd lived there for generations. Number 4427 stood at the end of the block, a 2-story structure painted in peeling yellow. Its owner, a woman named Dorothy Pemberton, had purchased the property in 1973 with money from an inheritance. To her neighbors, she seemed perfectly ordinary, perhaps a bit odd, but harmless. She was 46 years old, unmarried, worked as a veterinary assistant at the Powell Boulevard Animal Clinic. She kept to herself mostly, though she was always pleasant during brief encounters. She had no criminal record. She paid her bills on time. She watered her garden every Sunday morning. Dorothy was just normal, recalled her neighbor Mrs. Helen Chen in a 1979 interview. She loved animals. That's what we all knew about her. She talked about her pets constantly. She called them her babies. I thought she meant cats or dogs. We all did. But Dorothy's concept of pet ownership had evolved into something else entirely, something that began, perhaps, with innocent devotion to animal care and metastasized over years into a twisted philosophy that would ultimately cost someone everything. The house itself gave few external clues to what lay beneath. The windows remained curtained but not blocked. The yard, while slightly overgrown, wasn't abandoned. Mail was collected regularly. Dorothy came and went on a predictable schedule. In every visible way, 4427 Willamette Street appeared to be just another house on just another Portland street. But basements hide secrets, and Dorothy Pemberton's basement held a secret that would eventually force Portland to confront an uncomfortable question: how well do we really know anyone? The year 1978 was also significant for another reason. The legal protections we now take for granted for vulnerable adults were virtually non-existent. Social services were underfunded and understaffed. Missing persons cases involving adults, particularly those without families actively searching, often went cold quickly. The infrastructure to catch predators who operated within their own homes simply wasn't there yet. This was the world Dorothy Pemberton inhabited, a world where privacy was paramount, where what happened in someone's home was their business, where strange sounds from a neighbor's basement might be noted but rarely reported. The first sign that something wasn't right came in March 1977, 18 months before the discovery. Gary Morrison, a postal carrier who'd worked the Willamette Street route for 6 years, noticed that Dorothy had begun receiving unusual deliveries. Large packages from industrial supply companies, lumber, metal brackets and chains from hardware suppliers. "I remember thinking she must be doing some serious renovation work," Morrison later recalled, "but I never saw contractors coming or going, and the packages just kept coming. What made Morrison particularly uneasy was the timing. The deliveries always arrived during his morning route, and Dorothy would be waiting at the door, not in a friendly way but with an intensity that unsettled him. She'd snatch the packages before I could even set them down properly, he said, like she was afraid I'd see inside or something. Morrison mentioned this to a few other carriers, but it was dismissed. People receive packages, people do home improvements. Nothing about it was technically suspicious. The second incident occurred in July 1977. Thomas Wexler lived next door at 4425 Willamette Street. He worked nights as a security guard and kept irregular hours. Around 3:00 a.m. on July 18th, he heard sounds coming through the shared wall, a rhythmic creaking, accompanied by what he described as weird animal sounds, but almost human-like. It was like someone making those sounds pets make when they're distressed, Wexler told investigators, whimpering, but there was a pattern to it, like. The fourth incident happened in September 1978, just 1 month before the discovery. A contractor named Dale Hammond was doing work on a house 2 doors down from Dorothy's property. During his lunch break, he walked to a nearby store and passed by 4427 on his return. Through a ground-level basement window partially obscured by overgrown shrubs, he glimpsed something that made him stop. "I saw this big wheel-looking thing," Hammond reported, "like a hamster wheel but way too big. And I swear I saw someone inside it, someone human-sized, moving. But it was only for a second before a curtain got pulled shut." Hammond stood there, confused. Had he really seen what he thought he'd seen? He walked back and tried to look again, but the curtain remained drawn. He mentioned it to his coworkers, who laughed it off. "Maybe she's into some weird fitness thing," one suggested. "Portland's full of hippies and weirdos." Hammond almost called the police. Almost. But what would he say? That he'd glimpsed something weird through a window? That he thought maybe someone was in a big wheel? It sounded absurd even to him, so he said nothing. Each of these incidents, taken alone, could be dismissed. Strange deliveries, odd noises, a defensive reaction to questions, a glimpse of something unusual. None of it proved anything. None of it was enough to trigger intervention. But taken together, they formed a pattern, a constellation of warning signs that the community failed to recognize because humans are fundamentally optimistic. We want to believe our neighbors are normal. We want to believe the uncomfortable feelings we get are just our imagination. We want to believe that terrible things don't happen on tree-lined streets, where people water their gardens on Sunday mornings. Dorothy Pemberton understood this about human nature. She relied on it. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. The call that changed everything came at 2:17 p.m. on October 14, 1978. A water main had broken on Willamette Street, and city workers needed to access basement shutoff valves in several homes. When they knocked on Dorothy Pemberton's door, she initially refused to let them enter. She insisted she could handle the shutoff herself. But water was flooding into neighboring properties, and the city workers weren't taking no for an answer. They informed Dorothy that they had the legal right to access the shutoff valve in an emergency. Dorothy's face went through a series of expressions: panic, calculation, resignation. Finally, she opened the door but positioned herself to block their path to the basement. "I'll go down and turn it off," she said. "You don't need to come down." But the lead worker, a man named Frank Cisneros, had been doing this job for 15 years. He knew that homeowners often couldn't locate the correct valve. He insisted on accompanying Dorothy downstairs. What Cisneros saw when Dorothy opened the basement door would be seared into his memory forever. The basement had been completely transformed. The concrete walls were covered with pegboards, holding various tools and implements. A chart on one wall detailed a feeding schedule, with times marked in 15-minute increments. Another chart tracked water intake. A third showed what appeared to be an exercise routine. But it wasn't the charts that caused Cisneros to freeze in horror. In the center of the room stood the wheel, 7 feet in diameter, constructed from 2x4s and plywood, mounted on a central axis fitted with industrial ball bearings that allowed it to spin. The inside surface was padded with thin foam, worn down in places to the bare wood beneath. Leather restraints dangled at multiple points around the interior. An elaborate pulley system connected the wheel to a winch mechanism that, investigators would later determine, allowed Dorothy to adjust the resistance and speed. And inside the wheel was Sarah Stroud. She wasn't dead, but in many ways, she was no longer quite alive either. Sarah's body had adapted to captivity in ways that seemed almost impossible. Her legs were grotesquely muscular, overdeveloped from months of forced movement in the wheel. Her arms, conversely, had atrophied from lack of use, thin as branches, the muscle tissue wasted away. Her blonde hair, long in the photograph her sister carried, had been shaved off. She wore what appeared to be a modified pet harness that kept her secured to the wheel's restraint system. But it was her eyes that Cisneros would never forget. They had a quality he struggled to describe, simultaneously empty and full of terror, human and animal, present and absent. Later, a psychiatrist would explain this as a manifestation of extreme trauma and conditioning, a psychological state where the victim's sense of self had been systematically dismantled and reconstructed according to the captor's design. She was moving, Cisneros later testified, his voice barely above a whisper. Just walking in the wheel, like she didn't even notice we were there, like she'd been doing it for so long it was just automatic, and Dorothy was just standing there, not even trying to run, like she didn't understand what she'd done wrong. The Portland Police Department arrived within 8 minutes of Cisneros' emergency call. Officers found Dorothy Pemberton sitting calmly on her living room couch, petting a cat. She didn't resist arrest. That when Sarah came to her, she was broken, addicted, homeless, purposeless. Dorothy said she'd given Sarah meaning. She'd given her routine, exercise, regular meals. She talked about Sarah like she was a rescue animal she'd rehabilitated. The paramedics who entered the basement faced an unprecedented medical situation. Sarah was conscious but unresponsive to verbal commands. She continued trying to walk even after being removed from the wheel, her legs moving in a repetitive motion. She made sounds, whimpering, high-pitched noises, but no words. When touched, she flinched and curled into a defensive posture that medical staff recognized from severely abused animals. Her body temperature was low, the lead paramedic, Jennifer Walsh, reported. Her blood pressure was abnormal. She had pressure sores, signs of malnutrition despite Dorothy's claims of regular feeding. But what really struck me was the behavioral response. Sarah had been conditioned. Every movement, every sound, it was all learned behavior from months of captivity. The basement yielded additional horrors as investigators documented the scene. Notebooks filled with Dorothy's handwriting detailed every aspect of Sarah's care. Feeding times, exercise durations, behavioral observations, adjustment protocols. Dorothy had approached Sarah's captivity with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to her work at the veterinary clinic. One notebook entry, dated December 1977, 6 months into Sarah's captivity, read, "Subject shows excellent progress. Initial resistance has decreased significantly. Responds appropriately to feeding signals. Exercise routine completed without protest. Vocalizations have normalized to acceptable range. Consider this a successful rehabilitation case study." Dorothy had documented everything. In her worldview, humans who couldn't function properly in society were fundamentally no different from injured or traumatized animals. They needed someone to provide structure, routine, discipline. They needed someone to make decisions for them. She believed she was providing a service. She believed she was helping. "The problem with social services," she wrote in one journal entry from 1976, "is that they respect human dignity too much. They let broken people make bad choices in the name of freedom. But what good is freedom to someone who will only use it to destroy themselves? True care requires control." This philosophy had been germinating for years. Investigators traced it back to Dorothy's childhood. She'd grown up on a farm in rural Oregon, the youngest of 5 children. Her father was an alcoholic who frequently abandoned the family for weeks at a time. Her mother was overwhelmed and emotionally unavailable. Dorothy found solace with animals. They were predictable, trainable, capable of giving unconditional love if properly managed. "Dorothy told me once that animals were better than people because you could shape them," recalled a former college roommate. "She said people were too stubborn, too insistent on their own way. I thought it was just cynical talk. Everyone says stuff like that sometimes." But for Dorothy, it wasn't just talk. After failing out of a nursing program in the late 1960s, dismissed for inappropriate boundary issues with patients, she'd pivoted to veterinary assistance. For years, she'd satisfied her need for control through her work. But something had shifted when she inherited money and bought her house. Suddenly, she had space, privacy, resources. The timeline suggested Dorothy had been planning something like Sarah's captivity for at least 2 years before it happened. She refused to move in the wheel. But Dorothy had planned for resistance. She controlled all food and water. She controlled temperature. The basement could be made very cold or uncomfortably warm. She controlled light. kept Sarah in darkness except during training sessions. Subject shows persistent non-compliance, Dorothy wrote in week 3. Have reduced caloric intake by 30, adjusted water schedule to reward compliance. Subject must understand that cooperation results in improved conditions. By month 2, Sarah's resistance was crumbling. By month 4, she was compliant. By month 6, she had been completely conditioned. She walked in the wheel when Dorothy told her to walk. She drank when told to drink. She made the sounds Dorothy had trained her to make, soft whimpering noises that Dorothy found soothing. The psychiatric evaluation of Sarah Stroud took months. Dr. Margaret Voss, a specialist in trauma psychology, worked with Sarah at Oregon State Hospital. The diagnosis was unprecedented, a combination of Stockholm Syndrome, learned helplessness, and what Dr. Voss termed forced behavioral regression. Sarah had been systematically dehumanized, Dr. Voss explained in court testimony. Every aspect of her identity as an autonomous person had been stripped away and replaced with conditioned responses. She'd been trained to behave, like Dorothy's other pets. And the tragic thing is, part of Sarah had accepted this. It was the only way to survive. The legal proceedings against Dorothy Pemberton were complicated by her mental state. Her defense attorneys argued she was delusional, that she genuinely believed she was helping Sarah. Prosecutors argued that the meticulous planning and documentation proved she understood exactly what she was doing. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators trying to understand how something this horrific could happen. Dorothy showed no remorse during testimony. When asked if she understood that she'd harmed Sarah, Dorothy responded, "I gave her purpose. I gave her routine. She was dying on the streets. I saved her life." In February 1979, Dorothy Pemberton was convicted of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault. She was sentenced to 25 years in Oregon State Prison. She died there in 1991 from cancer, still insisting she had done nothing wrong. Sarah Stroud's recovery was long and partial. She regained the ability to speak, though she rarely did. Her sister Rebecca became her guardian. Sarah would spend the rest of her life in supervised care, never fully returning to independent living. The physical damage to her body could be addressed. Physical therapy helped restore some muscle balance, but the psychological damage was permanent. "My sister survived," Rebecca said in a 1985 interview. "But the Sarah I knew didn't survive that basement." Dorothy didn't just imprison her body. She imprisoned who she was as a person. She erased her. The investigation also revealed that Dorothy had been searching for additional subjects. In her bedroom, investigators found a list of names, all women with addiction or mental health issues who Dorothy had encountered through various means. Sarah Stroud's name was on the list, with a check mark next to it. 4 other names had been circled. Police contacted all 4 women. 3 were accounted for and safe. The 4th, a woman named Michelle Torres, had been reported missing 6 months earlier. Her case remained unsolved. Whether Dorothy had attempted to take Michelle Torres, whether Michelle had escaped or refused Dorothy's initial overtures, or whether she had met some other fate would never be conclusively determined. But the possibility that Sarah Stroud wasn't Dorothy's first victim haunted investigators for years afterward. The Pemberton case sent shockwaves through Oregon's legal and social services systems. It exposed catastrophic failures in missing persons investigations, particularly involving vulnerable adults. It revealed how easily someone could vanish when society had already written them off as unreliable, troubled, or transient. In 1980, Oregon passed what became known as Sarah's Law, legislation that mandated more aggressive investigation of missing persons cases involving adults with mental health or addiction issues. It required regular welfare checks for individuals in transitional housing situations. It established a statewide database for missing persons that law enforcement agencies were required to actively maintain. Other states followed Oregon's lead. The Pemberton case was cited in arguments for improved social services, better mental health support, and stronger protections for vulnerable populations. It became a touchstone in discussions about how society fails its most at-risk members. The case also raised disturbing questions about the nature of captivity and conditioning. Dr. Voss published several papers based on her work with Sarah Stroud, contributing to the developing understanding of complex trauma and how sustained captivity affects the human psyche. Her work would later be cited in cases involving cult survivors, domestic abuse victims, and prisoners of war. In Portland's southeast neighborhood, the case left lasting scars. The house at 4427 Willamette Street was eventually demolished in 1982. The vacant lot remained empty for years. No developer wanted the stigma. Eventually, a small park was created on the site. A single plaque mentions that the park is dedicated to survivors of violence, with no specific reference to what happened there. "We wanted to forget," Helen Chen, the neighbor, said years later, "but forgetting is dangerous. What happened to Sarah Stroud happened because people didn't pay attention, because we saw warning signs and told ourselves they didn't mean anything, because we valued privacy and minding our own business more than we valued a vulnerable woman's life." The case also sparked uncomfortable conversations about the field of animal training and veterinary care. While no one suggested that animal care professionals were inherently dangerous, the Pemberton case revealed how expertise in controlling animal behavior could be twisted toward horrific ends. Professional organizations implemented new ethical guidelines and training protocols focused on appropriate boundaries and recognizing warning signs of concerning behavior. Perhaps most significantly, the Pemberton case contributed to broader cultural awareness about the dynamics of predatory behavior. Dorothy didn't fit the stereotype of a violent criminal. She was middle-aged, female, employed, seemingly normal. The case challenged assumptions about who could be dangerous and reminded society that monsters come in all forms. Criminologists studied the Pemberton case extensively. Dr. Robert Hannigan, a forensic psychologist, identified it as an example of what he termed caretaker sadism, a pattern where individuals with authority over vulnerable populations gradually escalate controlling behaviors until they cross into criminal abuse. Dorothy Pemberton represents a particular type of offender we didn't have good language for in the 1970s, Dr. Hannigan explained. She wasn't motivated by sexual sadism or rage. She was motivated by a desire for control masquerading as care. She genuinely believed her actions were beneficial. This makes offenders like her particularly dangerous because they don't see themselves as doing anything wrong, which means they'll continue escalating until stopped by external force. The case files remained sealed for years to protect Sarah's privacy, but in 2008, portions were released to researchers studying false imprisonment and psychological torture. The detailed documentation Dorothy kept provided unprecedented insight into the methods predators used to break down their victims, resistance, and sense of self. In 2015, Rebecca Stroud, Sarah's sister, published a memoir titled The Girl in the Wheel. She wrote it, she said, not to sensationalize her sister's suffering, but to ensure that Sarah's story served as a warning and a call to action. "We failed my sister," Rebecca wrote in the book's introduction. "Society failed her when she was struggling with addiction. The system failed her when she went missing. Her neighbors failed her when they heard strange sounds and did nothing. I failed her when I took the police's word." The book became a bestseller and was used in social work training programs across the country. It sparked renewed interest in the case and led to policy reforms in several states regarding missing persons investigations and protections for vulnerable adults. Sarah Stroud herself never spoke publicly about her ordeal. According to Rebecca, Sarah lived quietly in a group home setting, working on art therapy projects that she rarely showed anyone. She had good days and bad days. She had moments of connection and long stretches of withdrawal. She lived with the aftermath of Dorothy Pemberton's care every single day until her death from pneumonia in 2003 at age 48. "My sister never really came home from that basement," Rebecca said at Sarah's funeral. "But she fought every day to survive what was done to her. That took more courage than most people will ever understand." What do you think drove Dorothy Pemberton to such acts? Was it genuine delusion, or did she understand the horror of what she was doing? Could better intervention systems have prevented Sarah's captivity? Or was Dorothy's operation too carefully designed to detect? Leave your theories in the comments below. And tell us, have you ever ignored a warning sign about a neighbor or friend because it seemed too uncomfortable to address? How do we balance respecting privacy with protecting vulnerable people? This case reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a kind face. Sometimes it talks gently to animals. Sometimes it lives on ordinary streets in ordinary houses. Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of American history, the stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and society's failures. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And remember, if something feels wrong, say something. Sarah Stroud's tragedy might have been prevented if just one person had trusted their instincts and made that call. See you in the next video.